All right, so you guys have given us like a ton of material this time.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
And it's all about, those things that get in the way when you're trying to actually like achieve something big. So what we want to do in this deep dive is to go beyond just, lifting out those roadblocks.
Right.
We want to really dig into why these things, based on what you guys have sent in, trip us up, and more importantly, how to actually, get past them.
Absolutely. I think, and like you said, you've given us so much material, so diverse.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that it really emphasizes is that, success is such a personal thing.
Right.
It could be, for some people, financial security. For other people, it's a deeper sense of purpose. For other people, it's really strong connections or leaving, some kind of lasting impact.
Yeah.
But what I think is fascinating is that even though those definitions are all over the place, the reasons that we stumble, those underlying reasons, often share kind of these commonalities.
Right.
So it's almost like a personalized roadmap of what are those things that get in our way.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just dive into it.
Okay.
Something I think resonates with pretty much everyone: fear of failure.
Yeah.
Your research really emphasized this as, just like a base level obstacle for so many people.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I remember from one of the studies you guys sent me was, almost describing it as this like deeply ingrained protective mechanism. We're naturally inclined to, avoid potential harm. And in many ways, failing at something, it activates that same kind of cautious response.
Right. Makes sense.
But I think one of the things that I really was just stark was the statistic that over half of people dream of starting a business, but only a small fraction actually take that step.
Yeah. It's a huge difference.
Yeah.
Over 50% are held back by, what are the big things? What are they afraid of?
I think the big things are, and they were pretty consistent across the board, losing their financial investment, the money they put in,
right,
facing, kind of public scrutiny, judgment.
Like ridicule. Yeah. Right.
Ridicule, exactly.
Yeah.
Or just even damaging their reputation.
Yeah, you put yourself out there and
totally.
It doesn't work.
And it doesn't work. But I think the really kind of crucial point that a lot of the articles brought up was, that this fear itself can create this barrier.
Right.
That, by avoiding that risk of failure, people are kind of, sometimes inadvertently preventing the possibility of success.
Yeah. So it's almost like we're preemptively defeating ourselves.
Exactly.
And I know, there was some interesting stuff about changing our perspective on failure, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we look at that differently?
Well, I think, rather than seeing it as this kind of, definitive endpoint,
yeah,
the articles really encouraged you to see it as this indispensable part of the process.
Yeah.
That learning. And the example that kept coming up was Thomas Edison and his light bulb.
Yeah.
That he had all of these, attempts that didn't work.
Right. Thousands.
But they weren't useless. It was, each one was informing, the next step.
So each one was like data.
Yeah.
It was just information gathering.
Information gathering, exactly. And that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
But I think, how do you actually change that?
Yeah, how do you make that shift?
Especially when it feels, when it feels scary. When it feels like there's a lot at stake.
Totally.
And I think a lot of the articles had a really practical suggestion, which is start small.
Okay.
Start with more manageable risks.
Like baby steps, kind of.
Baby steps, exactly. Yeah. And it's almost like you're building a tolerance.
Yeah.
You're getting used to that feeling of potential setback.
Yeah.
And you're learning from it in a way that's less threatening.
Right.
But I think the really important thing is, and this was emphasized a lot, is, to really consciously reflect. After every attempt, regardless of the outcome, sit down and really think about, what can I take from this? How can I change what I'm doing moving forward?
I like that. It's taking the data and doing something with it.
Totally.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so next up, something that I've definitely struggled with: lack of clear goals.
Oh, yeah.
Where, you have an idea of what you want, but you haven't really nailed down the specifics.
Absolutely. And I think your sources, they really hit on this as just this major thing that gets in the way.
Yeah.
Because, these really general aspirations, I want to be more successful, or, I want to be happy, or whatever. Like, it just doesn't give you that direction to, really fuel consistent action. Like, how are you actually going to measure that?
Yeah, it's almost like, I was reading one of the things that you pulled out. It was about fitness.
Yes.
And it was like saying, I want to get in shape is so different than saying, I want to be able to run a 5K in under 30 minutes by the end of the year.
Exactly.
One is a wish and the other one is like almost instructions.
Yeah, totally.
So how do you get from that vague desire to something more concrete?
Well, everything pointed to this SMART framework, which is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Okay. That's a lot, but
I think what it really does is it forces you to define those aspirations in a way that you can act on them and you can track them.
Okay. So walk us through it. Like, let's say, I want to improve my finances.
Right. How do we make that SMART?
Okay. So instead of, I want to improve my finances, you might say, I will increase my savings by $5,000 within the next 12 months.
Okay.
By allocating $400 per month from my current income. So there's, action.
You're getting specific.
You're getting specific, and exploring one new side income opportunity that I will dedicate at least 5 hours per week to. So, in that case, it's specific, right? Increase savings by a particular amount. It's measurable. $5,000. Hopefully it's achievable, depending on your financial situations.
Yeah.
It's relevant, right? To, I want to improve my finances, and then it's time bound.
Within the year.
Within 12 months. And I think, and this was emphasized a lot in the material, is breaking it down and, like weekly tasks, monthly tasks. It really makes a difference in terms of, staying motivated and not feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah. That makes sense. When you see it broken down that way, it seems a lot more attainable.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's move on to another thing that pretty much everyone I know struggles with. Procrastination.
Oh, yeah.
Like that tendency to put off what's really important for something, that's not.
Yeah.
And, in a nutshell, you guys defined it as that act of delaying important tasks.
Right.
Often in favor of something that's more immediately gratifying or, just less demanding.
Right. Like gives you that instant gratification, but it's not moving you towards, where you want to be long term.
And I think there was a stat like 20% of adults.
Yeah, something like that.
Identify as chronic procrastinators.
Which is a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting. Like, the research said it's not laziness. It's, what was the term? Emotional regulation.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting. A lot of the sources talked about that. And I thought that's really insightful because I think we think, oh, I'm just being lazy.
Right.
But it's actually more about almost like a way of avoiding these negative feelings that come up when you think about the task.
Okay, so give us an example. Like, what kind of negative feelings are we talking about?
Well, you might think about a task and it feels overwhelming.
Sure.
Or, really boring.
Yeah.
Or, it's super stressful.
Or there's a chance you might fail at it.
Or you might fail at it, exactly. Yeah. And so by putting it off, you're getting this like temporary relief from that discomfort.
But then what happens?
Well, then, as a lot of your sources pointed out, like that avoidance can really backfire.
Yeah.
Because, as the deadline gets closer and closer, the stress, the guilt, the anxiety, it all kind of piles up.
Right. Like that student who puts off studying all semester.
Oh, yeah. Classic.
And then it's like the night before and they're cramming.
Totally. And they haven't really, absorbed the material.
So how do you stop that? Like, how do you break that cycle?
Well, there were a lot of great strategies in your sources.
Yeah.
And one of the key recommendations that came up again and again was to, kind of figure out what your personal procrastination triggers are. What are those things that make you want to delay?
So almost like know thyself.
Yeah, exactly. And once you kind of figure out what those patterns are, then you can start to like, okay, how do I deal with this?
Okay.
Another technique, a lot of them mention the 2-minute rule, which I love.
I like that.
It's so simple. If you can do it in under 2 minutes, just do it.
Just do it.
Get it done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it really helps you kind of, build that momentum.
Yeah. Get those little things out of the way.
Exactly.
Okay. And then what about the bigger things? Like, I can see how that works for the small stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think for bigger tasks, breaking them down into smaller steps, like really small steps.
Yeah.
and a lot of times just starting with like the easiest thing.
Okay.
You know, that can often be enough to kind of get you over that initial hurdle.
Yeah, just got to start somewhere. Okay, so let's talk about something that, is sometimes mistaken for diligence.
Yeah.
Seeking perfection.
Perfectionism.
The double-edged sword.
Yeah, it really is. It gets praised a lot as a virtue.
Right.
But as you know, your sources were really pointing out, like, it can really get in your way.
Yeah.
It's great to have high standards, but if you are waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect plan, the perfect outcome, you're never going to do anything.
I know so many people like that, and honestly, I've been guilty of it myself. It's like you get in that analysis paralysis.
Totally.
You're waiting for all the stars to align, and it never happens.
And the cost of that, according to the material that you sent me, is that you miss opportunities. Because especially, in the world that we're living in today where things are changing so quickly, speed and iteration are way more valuable than trying to, reach this ideal that doesn't even exist.
So how do we break free of this need for everything to be perfect?
I think one of the key insights from all of the material is to embrace the idea of good enough, especially for the first iteration.
Okay.
Have high standards, but also understand that feedback and actually putting it out in the world, is going to give you the most valuable information.
Yeah.
And there was this quote from Reid Hoffman. I don't know if you know him. He's the co-founder of LinkedIn. And he famously said, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched too late.
I love that.
It's so true. Getting something out there and seeing how people respond to it is so much better than, working on it in secret for years and trying to make it this, this perfect thing.
Yeah, and I think that ties into what we're talking about earlier, like taking failure as data.
Totally.
So you put it out there, maybe it's not perfect. You get that feedback. You learn from it.
Absolutely.
You make it better. Okay, let's move on to something else that, I think underpins a lot of successful things. Self-discipline.
Yeah.
And, a lot of your sources were saying, like, it's more important than just motivation.
Totally. I think motivation is great, get you started.
Yeah, it's that initial spark.
It's the spark. But as all the sources were saying, it's not a sustainable fuel source.
It's fickle. It comes and goes.
It really does. And I think, real success, whatever that means for you, it's so much more about consistent effort, even when you don't feel like it. I think a lot of us, we do things when we feel like it.
Yeah, you're relying on that motivation.
But the material is really making a distinction between dreamers and achievers.
Right.
And the achievers are the ones who just show up consistently.
Like day in and day out.
Rain or shine. Yeah. And I think, you guys sent me some really great examples of this. Serena Williams, her training regimen, she does it all year round.
Wow. Even in the off season.
Even in the off season.
Yeah.
And then you had Stephen King. He writes a certain number of words every day,
right,
regardless of whether he feels inspired or not.
Like his job is to write.
That's his job. Exactly.
Pick it.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you cultivate that? Like if it doesn't come naturally to you, how do you become more self-disciplined?
Well, all the advice that you sent was, start small, like really small.
Yeah.
Choose one or two kind of key habits that you want to build.
Okay.
And really focus on those. It could be as simple as, spending 15 minutes every day on a particular task, or a really short exercise routine. And a lot of your articles mentioned, habit trackers.
Yeah.
Which are, they give you that visual reinforcement.
It's like checking things off.
Yeah, it's like checking things off. And it does give you that sense of accomplishment.
Like you're building momentum.
You're building momentum. And over time, you start small, you're consistent, and it really strengthens your capacity for self-discipline.
So you're not so reliant on that fleeting motivation.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, let's talk about something that's so important, I think, in anything you want to do, which is not underestimating the power of learning.
Oh, yeah. Continuous learning.
It's continuous learning, yeah.
And especially in, the world today, it's changing so rapidly.
Constantly.
That if you, refuse to, learn and adapt, it's going to be a big problem.
Yeah.
If you think you already know everything you need to know, you're going to be obsolete.
You're going to be like left behind.
Totally left behind. And there was a great example you guys sent me about a marketing professional who was using like all these old school techniques.
Like while the internet's happening.
Well, the internet's happening, social media, like, come on.
Yeah.
And it's just like, trying to use, tools from like the rotary phone era.
Right. To fix a smartphone.
Totally. To fix a smartphone. Exactly.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
But I think, and this was emphasized, a lot, is it's not just about professional development.
Yeah, this is for anybody.
This is for anybody who's, trying to, improve themselves, achieve any goal, really.
Yeah.
And the example you guys had about Warren Buffett.
Oh, yeah.
Like spending most of his day reading.
Yeah.
It shows that commitment to learning, to acquiring knowledge is something that even people at the highest level.
Yeah. They don't just stop.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what do we do? What's the proactive thing? How do we make this a habit?
Well, I think, one of the things that your sources really emphasized was adopting a growth mindset.
Yeah.
Like believing that you can actually, improve, you can learn new things, and your intelligence can be developed.
Right.
Actively looking for new information, and there's so many sources now, books, podcasts,
articles, online courses, mentorship, talking to other people.
Yeah.
People who disagree with you.
Yeah, exactly. Like getting different perspectives.
Yeah.
And just making time for it.
Yeah.
Even if it's just, a little bit every day, every week, it's just about, staying curious and knowing that pursuit of knowledge is ongoing.
Yeah, it doesn't end. Okay. Curiosity, that's the key. Okay, let's talk about your environment.
Okay.
Surrounding yourself with the wrong people.
Oh, that's a big one.
Like how big of a deal is this?
It's massive.
Yeah.
I think all of your sources, they emphasized how much the people you're around, they influence your thoughts, your beliefs, and ultimately your actions.
Yeah.
And, being around people who are negative or who lack ambition or, who discourage you, like it can create this real drag on your progress. Think about friends who, just dismiss your ideas.
Right.
Or a partner who, just is resistant to change.
Yeah.
Or colleagues who, they just gossip all the time.
It's like you're trying to run a race and you've got like people just hanging on to you.
Totally.
Trying to pull you back.
Yeah. It's like trying to, climb a hill and people are pulling you down.
Yeah, exactly.
And one of the quotes that came up a lot was Jim Rohn. He said, "You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with."
Oh, I've had that one.
Yeah, it's a good one. And it really sums up this idea.
Yeah.
And a lot of your material was also referencing, there's actual studies that show like how behavior, how attitudes, they spread through social networks.
So it's almost like we catch these things.
Totally.
From the people we're around.
Exactly.
Okay. So what's the takeaway here?
Well, I think it's about, it's almost like you need to consciously choose your environment.
Curate it,
exactly. Be really intentional about who you're spending time with.
Yeah.
And, look for those people who, who inspire you, who challenge you in a good way.
Yeah.
Who offer support, who share your values, your ambitions.
Yeah.
And it might mean actively seeking out mentors.
Yeah.
Joining groups or communities that are aligned with your goals or just, spending more time with the positive influences that you already have.
Right.
And it's also okay, to limit your exposure to those relationships that drain you.
Yeah.
That aren't necessarily bad people.
Yeah.
But, you need to protect your energy. You need to protect your time.
So it's almost like creating like a healthy ecosystem for yourself.
Totally.
Okay. So that makes sense. Okay. Let's talk about another kind of drain. Overcommitting.
Oh, yeah.
Saying yes to everything.
Yes. I am so guilty of this.
Oh, me too. I think we all are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think especially if you're the kind of person who, is driven, you see opportunities, you're like, yes, I want to do that.
You want to help.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as all of your sources pointed out, the cost of that is that you're diluting your focus, and your impact.
Yeah.
Think about, that freelancer who takes on every single project.
Regardless of how much it pays or if it's even a good fit.
Yeah. And then they're just overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And they can't do their best work.
Yeah.
Or, the entrepreneur who, has like 10 different things going on at once.
And nothing really, gets the attention it deserves. It's like spreading yourself too thin.
Spreading yourself too thin, totally.
And the result is, a lot of times you feel busy, but you're not really productive.
Exactly. You're busy but not productive, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, real success, it requires that focus.
Yeah.
It requires that you're making deliberate decisions about where to put your energy.
Yeah. So you're saying it's almost more important to say no sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just saying no to bad opportunities. It's even saying no to good opportunities if they don't align with your priorities.
So even if it's something that, you'd enjoy doing.
Totally.
You have to think about, like, what's the bigger picture here?
What's the bigger picture? And there was a great example, about Steve Jobs and how he simplified Apple's product line.
Oh, yeah. That was drastic.
Yeah, it was drastic.
Yeah.
But he basically, he cut out all these distractions, so that they could really focus on making, a few things amazing.
So it's like focusing by subtraction.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's so powerful. So, yeah, how do we get better at saying no?
Yeah, I think that's something we could all use some help with.
Totally. Well, the material that you sent, it suggested that we, sit down and really clarify our values, our top priorities.
Like, what's most important to us?
Yeah. And then when you have that clear understanding,
Yeah.
It's easier to look at the requests that are coming in.
And decide, like, okay, does this fit in?
Does this fit?
Does this fit in with my values and my goals?
And be able to say no to those things that don't.
Yeah.
Even if it's hard.
Yeah.
Because you're protecting your time, you're protecting your energy.
Which ultimately makes you more effective.
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about something that's so basic, but it's easy to overlook.
Okay.
Ignoring your health.
Oh, yeah.
Like, in the pursuit of everything else, we sometimes let this one slip.
Absolutely. And I think, all of your sources really emphasize this. Like,
Right.
It's short-sighted.
Yeah.
If you're sacrificing your sleep, good nutrition, exercise, just to be more productive in the short term, it's going to catch up with you.
Yeah, it's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable.
And a lot of your research was pointing to, like, how it affects our mental capacity, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There were several articles that talked about how, if you're stressed, you're sleep deprived, you're not going to be thinking as clearly.
Yeah, and you're less creative.
Less creative. You're not making good decisions.
It's like trying to run a marathon on an empty tank.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think the really key takeaway, that came up again and again was there's this connection between, your physical and mental well. All right, so that feeling, right? When a name is just right there on the tip of your tongue.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Totally. And we got some really cool articles from you guys about why that happens, why our memories, why they sometimes completely fail us.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Totally. And so today, we're taking a deep dive into that very question. Is forgetting, is it like a glitch in our brains?
Yeah.
Or is it, and this is going to sound weird, is it actually like a feature?
A feature?
Yeah. The stuff you sent makes a pretty strong case that it might actually be a good thing sometimes.
Right. And the fact that we all experience forgetting, it's like this universal human thing. That's what makes it so interesting to figure out how it works and how come it doesn't always work.
Exactly. So based on what you sent over, here's the plan for today's deep dive. We'll start with memory basics. How does this thing even work?
The nuts and bolts.
Then we'll dig into why we forget things, from those little everyday slips to the bigger memory lapses that were talked about in one of those studies you sent. And then, get this, we'll even explore how forgetting might actually be a good thing, like some of the articles hinted at.
Interesting.
And of course, we'll try to give you some practical tips and tricks so you can maybe, just maybe, remember where you left your keys a little more often.
Always helpful.
Right. We're basically taking a deep dive into how your brain works, directly from the stuff you guys sent in. So how do we even make memories in the first place? Let's start there.
Great, let's do it.
So the first step is called encoding. It's basically your brain taking in everything around you, the sights, the sounds, the smells.
All that sensory stuff.
And it converts it all into like a brain-friendly language that it can store. It's kind of like typing words into a computer. You got to put it in the right format, right?
Right.
I remember you highlighted that attention plays a big role in one of the articles.
Absolutely. And coding isn't just something that passively happens to you. The more you focus, the more effort you put into processing what's going on around you, the stronger that memory is going to be right from the start. Think about it this way. You're having two conversations, right? One you're barely paying attention to, and one where you're hanging on every word. which one are you going to remember better?
The one I'm actually paying attention to.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So you've got to be in the moment to even capture that information in the first place. Okay, so you've encoded the information right. What next? Where does it go?
Storage.
Right, storage.
That's where that encoded information gets held onto for you. And different parts of your brain are involved, like short-term memory, sometimes called working memory. It's your brain's temporary scratch pad. You know, like when you look up a phone number real quick.
That scratch pad gets erased pretty quickly
for most of us.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's long-term memory. That's where stuff gets stored for, well, potentially your whole life.
Wow, a whole life.
And a few key players are involved here, like the hippocampus, which is like the memory maker. It's super important for forming those new long-term memories. You know, one of the articles really emphasized that.
Oh, yeah.
And the amygdala, which handles your emotions. That's why some memories feel so powerful. They're tied to emotion.
Yes, yeah.
You know, those vivid emotional moments that you easily recall. That's the amygdala at work, helping to make those memories strong for you.
Okay.
And then we've got the cerebral cortex. It's like the filing cabinet for tons of those long-term memories.
Okay, so we encode, it bounces around for a bit, and then hopefully it settles into long-term storage.
Yeah.
But even if it makes it there, that doesn't mean I can always get it back.
Yeah.
Which brings us to retrieval, the last piece of the memory puzzle.
Exactly. Retrieval is you going back into those mental files and finding what you need, but it's not always as easy as it sounds, right? No, it's like searching for a file on your computer. If it wasn't saved properly to begin with, you know, maybe you didn't encode or store it well, or if you don't use the right keywords to search for it, you're never going to find it. How well you can pull up a memory totally depends on how well you encoded and stored it in the first place. But sometimes, even memories that you did encode and store well, they just get lost for a while.
Which is exactly what we're trying to figure out. Why does that happen? Why do these memories that we know are somewhere in our brains just vanish? Okay, let's dig into the main culprits behind forgetting, and we'll use the theories from the stuff you sent. First up, decay theory.
Okay, so decay theory is actually pretty simple. It basically says that memories, especially the ones in short-term memory, they just fade away over time if you don't use them.
Like if I don't use it, I lose it.
Pretty much. Like, imagine a path through the woods. If nobody walks on it for years, it gets overgrown and disappears. It's the same with memories. If you don't use the neural pathways associated with a memory, they can weaken and eventually disappear.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about when I forget stuff that I think about a lot?
That's where interference comes in.
Right, interference.
That's when memories get all jumbled up and it's hard to pick out the one you need. That research paper you sent, it went into that pretty deep, didn't it?
It did.
So interference is basically when similar memories compete with each other. And there are two main types. Proactive interference is when older memories make it hard to learn new stuff.
Oh, like trying to remember a new password when my old one keeps popping up. I know the new one, but my brain just keeps going back to the old one.
Exactly. That's proactive interference for you. The old memory, the old password, is blocking the new one. And then there's retroactive interference, which is the flip side. That's when learning new stuff makes it hard to remember older things.
So if I spend weeks learning like a new computer program, I might forget how to use the old one that I used for years. It's like the new information overwrites the old stuff, and one of the articles talked about that.
Yep, you nailed it. That's retroactive interference. It's like your new learning is reaching back and messing with your older memories. So basically, the more you learn, the trickier it can be to recall older stuff. It's a reminder that what you know is always changing.
It's like my brain has a limited number of slots. When new stuff comes in, the old stuff gets pushed out.
A good analogy.
All right, so we've got decay and interference. What's next? Retrieval failure. Is that when the memory's there, but I just can't quite grasp it?
That's a great way to put it. Retrieval failure is when a memory exists in your brain somewhere, but you're missing the right cues to access it. Like, you know that tip of the tongue feeling?
Oh, the worst. I can almost feel the memory, but it's just out of reach.
Exactly. You know it, but you can't quite spit it out.
Yeah.
And what often happens is if someone gives you a little hint, maybe the first letter of the word or some detail about the event, boom, the memory comes flooding back, which proves that the memory was there all along. You just needed the right trigger.
Huh. That's pretty cool. Okay, now this next one seems a bit more psychological. Motivated forgetting.
Motivated forgetting.
It's the idea that we might, like, bury unpleasant memories on purpose.
Right. One of those psychology texts you sent talked about that.
It did?
And it suggests that sometimes you forget things because, well, you want to. It can be a conscious decision, like when you intentionally try to block something out. But it can also be subconscious, like your emotions playing a big role in what you remember and what you forget.
Huh. Interesting.
It is.
Okay, what about memory distortion? This is the idea that memories aren't like perfect recordings. They can actually change over time.
Right. It makes you think, huh?
Yeah, it kind of freaks me out. Does that mean I can remember things that never even happened?
It's possible. And it just goes to show that memory isn't always reliable. Your memories, you're actually rebuilding them every time you remember them. And during that process, your current beliefs, your feelings, even stuff other people say, it can all influence those memories.
Whoa, that's wild, like eyewitness testimony.
Exactly. The eyewitness testimony used to be like the gold standard.
Right.
But now we know it can be really unreliable. You know, leading questions, talking to other witnesses. It can change how someone remembers an event. It's something to keep in mind, for sure.
Definitely. So my memories are more like stories that I keep retelling, and those stories can change over time. Okay, last one. Brain damage and neurological conditions.
Right.
This one seems more straightforward. You know, there's damage, and so you forget.
Yes. With brain damage and neurological conditions, forgetting isn't because of those normal memory processes we've been talking about.
Right.
It's because there's been actual physical damage to the brain, or there's a disorder that affects how the brain handles memories. Think Alzheimer's, dementia, stroke, even head injuries. They can all really hurt your memory.
Wow.
And as people naturally age, their memory can decline too. Your sources brought that up a few times as well.
Yeah, they did. It's a reminder that memory is tied to our physical brains. Okay, so we've covered a bunch of reasons why we forget, from memories just fading away to interference to actual brain damage. Forgetting is a huge part of how our brains work. But you said earlier that forgetting might actually be a good thing. I got to know more about that. How can forgetting be good?
Well, think about it. Your brain is constantly bombarded with information. Imagine if you remembered every single thing.
Oh, gosh.
Every detail, every sensation. You'd be totally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Forgetting acts like a filter, helping you get rid of unnecessary information. It's not just deleting stuff. It's about prioritizing.
Yeah.
Making sure your brain focuses on what's important right now.
So my brain declutters for me, like getting rid of junk mail so I can see the important stuff.
Exactly. By forgetting the little things, you free up space to remember the things that matter. It makes your brain more efficient and helps you make better decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. If I remembered every conversation I've ever had, I wouldn't get anything done.
Right.
Too much information.
Exactly. And it's not just about being efficient. Forgetting can also be good for your emotional well-being.
Okay.
Forgetting painful experiences, even though it's not always easy, it helps you move on. It builds your resilience.
So forgetting isn't just about thinking, it's about surviving. Letting go of the past so I can live in the present. It's a really interesting way to think about it. Okay, so forgetting is normal. It can even be helpful. But what about when I want to remember things better? Are there any tricks to improve my memory and stop forgetting so much?
There are some things you can do, and a lot of them go back to how memory works.
Okay.
Like one of the most basic is repetition. Like we were talking about with decay theory. The more you recall a memory, the stronger it gets. Spaced repetition is a great technique. It's basically revisiting information at longer and longer intervals.
Yeah, I've heard that's a good one.
The studies you shared, they backed that up. It's really good for long-term memory.
Interesting. Okay, what else? Mnemonics and memory aids.
Those can be really helpful.
I always thought those were kind of gimmicky.
They might seem like tricks, but they work because they make information easier to remember or recall. They're like shortcuts for your brain. Think of acronyms like ROYGBV for the colors of the rainbow.
Oh yeah, ROYGBV.
Or rhymes, visualization, connecting new information to things you already know. It's all about giving your brain stronger cues so it can grab onto those memories.
Like that old saying, every good boy does fine for remembering musical notes.
Exactly. It's silly, but it works. Okay, now let's talk about your overall health.
Oh, health too.
Your sources mentioned this too, didn't they?
Yeah.
Taking care of your body is super important for your brain, including your memory.
Okay.
Exercise gets more blood flowing to your brain. Eating healthy gives your brain the nutrients it needs. And sleep. Sleep is so important for consolidating memories. It's like when you sleep, your brain is working hard to make those new memories stick. A lot of your sources highlighted that.
So I'm making memories in my sleep.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And don't forget mental exercise. Puzzles, reading, anything that keeps your brain active helps.
So it's physical and mental exercise.
Makes sense. Now, what about when I'm actually trying to learn something new? Can I do anything to make that encoding process better?
Being mindful and focused when you're learning is huge. Get rid of distractions, really be in the moment. That way the information gets processed deeper and has a better chance of sticking.
It's tough these days with, phones and everything.
It is, but focusing is like a superpower for your memory.
I like that. And you mentioned emotional connection too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We tend to remember things better if they're tied to our emotions or if they mean something to us personally. So when you're learning, try to connect it to your own life, your interests, your goals. Make it meaningful, and it'll be more likely to stick with you.
It's true. I remember stuff way better if I can relate it to my own life somehow. Okay, last tip, retrieval practice. Is that kind of like repetition? It's similar, but instead of just passively reading or reviewing information, you actively try to recall it from memory. Like, test yourself. Even if it's just quizzing yourself in your head, it strengthens the connections in your brain and makes it easier to access that memory again later. It's a more active way to learn. Some of the studies you looked at showed amazing results with that.
So instead of reading my notes a million times, I should try to explain the concepts to myself or even someone else without looking.
Yeah.
Force myself to recall it.
Exactly. That active recall really makes a difference.
Okay, this has been a pretty incredible deep dive into memory and forgetting. I really appreciate the sources you sent. It's been super interesting. Let's recap what we've learned today.
Yes, let's.
So we've learned that forgetting isn't a failure. It's actually a normal and often very helpful part of how our brains work.
Right.
It keeps us from getting overloaded and helps us focus on what's important.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective too, which some of your readings touched on.
All right. You can't remember everything, but understanding how memory works, the encoding, storage, retrieval, that gives you the power to improve your memory.
Right.
Repetition, mnemonics, being healthy, paying attention, making learning meaningful, testing yourself. These are all things that can make a huge difference.
And at the end of the day, your memory, even with all its quirks, it's a big part of who you are. It shapes your identity. It helps you learn and grow from your experiences. You even wrote about that in your own notes.
Well, it did. It's true.
Which leads me to a final thought, and it gets a bit philosophical, but it's really interesting.
I'm listening.
We've talked about how memories aren't perfect. They can be distorted. So if that's true, what does that mean for who we are?
Ooh, I like that.
Right. What does that mean for our sense of self? What does it mean that our stories about our own lives are based on memories that might not be entirely accurate?
Big question.
It is. It is. Think about this, your most treasured memories. They're not perfect recordings. They're your brain's interpretation of what happened, as one of the articles said. It makes you wonder about the nature of memory and how much it shapes who you think you are. Something to ponder long after this deep dive is over.
Ever get that feeling like you want to just jump right in and really grasp those huge historical figures, the real game changers, but without having to spend weeks in a library or something?
Yeah, totally. Like getting to the heart of the matter without getting bogged down.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're going for today. So are you ready to dive into some of history's most impactful warriors and leaders?
Absolutely. I think it's fascinating to look at what made these individuals not just successful in battle, but real, icons, figures who left a lasting legacy.
Okay, so we've got this really interesting article here that dives into these legendary figures or military achievements and how their impact is still felt today.
Right. It's not just about battles and conquests. It's about their influence on culture, politics, even the way we think about leadership today.
So should we jump right in?
Yeah, let's get started.
Awesome. Okay, so first up, a name that pretty much everyone's heard of, Alexander the Great. This guy was unbelievable. I mean, by the age of 32, he'd already carved out an empire stretching from Greece all the way to India.
It's mind-blowing, right? And you can't talk about Alexander without mentioning his tutor, Aristotle.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I mean, having one of the greatest philosophers of all time as your teacher, that's got to give you a bit of an edge, right?
Absolutely. Aristotle's influence on Alexander's thinking, especially his strategic thinking, is undeniable. You see it in his military campaigns. It's not just brute force, it's calculated. It's like a game of chess on a massive scale.
And he was undefeated on the battlefield. That's insane. Think about battles like Issus and Gaugamela. Not just wins, they were total masterclasses in military tactics.
Exactly. And those victories weren't just about expanding territory. They were crucial in uniting the Greek city-states and then dismantling the Persian Empire under Darius III.
Yeah, that's a seismic shift in power, isn't it?
For sure. It totally reshaped the balance of power in the ancient world, and it wasn't just political. Alexander's conquests led to this incredible cultural exchange, the spread of Hellenistic culture, which blended Greek ideas with Eastern traditions.
Oh, yeah, like the city of Alexandria in Egypt, that became a huge center of learning.
Exactly, a real melting pot of knowledge and ideas, and that synthesis laid the groundwork for later civilizations like the Roman Empire.
I mean, talk about a lasting legacy.
No kidding.
Okay, so from one empire builder to another, let's talk about Genghis Khan. The Mongol Empire is still the largest contiguous empire in history. I mean, it's hard to even fathom how vast it was.
Yeah, and what's even more incredible is that he started as Temujin, just one guy who managed to unify all these warring Mongol tribes.
So he was kind of like a unifier before he was a conqueror.
Exactly. He had to bring his own people together before he could take on the rest of the world, and he did it by building this incredibly disciplined and effective military force.
And then once he had that force, well, he pretty much conquered everything in his path, didn't he? China, Central Asia, Persia, even parts of Europe.
Yeah, it was this incredible wave of expansion, and part of his success was due to his innovative military tactics. Like, he would use feigned retreats to lure enemies into traps, and he was a master of psychological warfare.
You mean like messing with their heads, getting them all scared and demoralized before the battle even started?
Exactly. He knew that winning a war wasn't just about physical strength. It was about breaking your enemy's will to fight. And it wasn't all about conquest either. The Pax Mongolica, the period of peace and stability that followed the Mongol conquests, actually fostered a lot of trade and cultural exchange along the Silk Road.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that. So like goods and ideas were flowing more freely than ever before.
Exactly. And that had a huge impact on the development of both Eastern and Western civilizations. And on top of that, Genghis Khan's legal and administrative reforms were pretty groundbreaking. They helped to create a system of governance that could manage this massive, diverse empire.
So not just a brilliant military leader, but a pretty savvy ruler too.
Absolutely. A complex and fascinating figure.
All right, now let's move on to ancient Rome and talk about Julius Caesar. This is the guy who pretty much single-handedly transformed Rome from a republic into an empire.
Yeah. Caesar was a force of nature. He was an exceptional general, a shrewd politician, and a master of self-promotion.
So a real triple threat.
Yeah, he had it all. And you see that in his conquest of Gaul, which massively expanded Roman territory, but also increased his own power and popularity.
And his military reforms were huge, right? He made the legions more professional, more loyal to him personally.
Exactly. He knew that a strong and loyal army was essential to achieving his ambitions. And let's not forget his victory in the Civil War against Pompey.
Yeah, that was the turning point, wasn't it?
Totally. It basically paved the way for him to become dictator, and that's when he really started to reshape Rome. He centralized power, introduced the Julian calendar, and laid the groundwork for the imperial system that his successor Augustus would later solidify.
So even though Caesar was assassinated, his vision for Rome ultimately prevailed.
Absolutely. His impact on the course of Roman history is undeniable.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few centuries to another military genius who dominated Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. This guy rose to power during the chaos of the French Revolution and quickly conquered most of the continent.
Yeah, Napoleon's rise was meteoric. He was a brilliant tactician and a master of exploiting opportunities. Just look at his victories at Austerlitz and Jena Auerstedt. Those were decisive battles that cemented his reputation as one of the greatest military commanders of all time.
And he wasn't just about winning battles. He crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804, basically declaring himself the most powerful man in Europe.
Yeah, and he introduced the Napoleonic Code, which had a huge influence on legal systems all over the world.
I mean, that's pretty impressive considering all the upheaval that was going on at the time.
Absolutely. The Napoleonic Code standardized laws and helped to modernize legal systems across Europe. And even though Napoleon's ambitions ultimately led to his downfall at Waterloo, his impact on Europe was massive. He modernized warfare, inspired nationalist movements, and left a legacy that's still debated today.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit and talk about a figure whose influence stemmed more from his ideas than from direct military command, Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War.
Sun Tzu, a true master strategist and philosopher.
Yeah, what's amazing is that The Art of War is still studied today by military leaders, business executives, even athletes.
It's timeless, right? And the core of his philosophy is about avoiding direct conflict whenever possible. It's about being cunning and strategic about outsmarting your opponent.
So it's not about brute force, it's about using your brain.
Exactly. Sun Tzu believed that the best way to win a war was to avoid fighting it altogether, or at least to minimize your losses. He emphasized the importance of knowing your enemy, knowing yourself and choosing your battles carefully.
And these ideas were based on his own experiences as a general, right?
Yeah, he served in the state of Wu during a time of constant warfare, so he knew what he was talking about. And his insights have resonated across cultures and centuries. They're applicable to so many different situations.
So not just a military strategy guide, but a blueprint for success in all areas of life.
Pretty much. That's why it's still so relevant today.
Okay, let's get back to some more battlefield commanders, starting with Hannibal Barca. This guy is legendary for leading his army across the Alps with elephants to attack Rome.
Yeah, talk about a bold move, right? It was an incredibly risky maneuver, but it showed Hannibal's strategic brilliance and his ability to inspire his troops.
And then he went on to inflict a crushing defeat on the Romans at the Battle of Cannae, right?
Exactly. Cannae is still studied in military academies today. It's a classic example of tactical brilliance. Hannibal used a double envelopment maneuver to surround and destroy a much larger Roman army.
So even though he ultimately lost the Second Punic War, he gave the Romans a run for their money.
Oh, absolutely. He forced them to adapt their tactics and rethink their strategies, and his military genius left an undeniable mark on Roman military thinking.
All right, now let's talk about Saladin, a leader who united the Muslim world and recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders.
Saladin is a fascinating figure. He was a brilliant military commander, but he was also known for his chivalry and his sense of justice.
Yeah, he had a reputation for being honorable even towards his enemies.
Exactly. After he recaptured Jerusalem, he allowed Christian pilgrims to continue visiting the city, and he treated the inhabitants with respect.
That's pretty remarkable considering the brutality that was common in warfare at that time.
Absolutely. It sets him apart from many other military leaders of his era. And his victory at the Battle of Hattin was a turning point in the Crusades. It showed that the Muslim world could unite and defeat the European powers.
So a major figure in both military and religious history.
Exactly. His legacy continues to inspire people today.
Okay, now let's talk about a leader who fought for freedom against overwhelming odds. Spartacus. He led a slave revolt against the might of Rome.
Yeah, Spartacus' story is a testament to the human spirit. He led a ragtag army of slaves and gladiators against the most powerful military force in the world.
I mean, talk about an underdog story.
Absolutely, and they actually won several battles against the Roman legions before they were eventually defeated.
So he was a brilliant military leader, but more importantly, he was a symbol of hope for the oppressed.
Exactly. Spartacus's rebellion has inspired countless people throughout history who are fighting for freedom and justice. He showed that even the most powerful empires can be challenged by those who are determined to break free from oppression.
His name has become synonymous with resistance, hasn't it?
Definitely a powerful and enduring symbol.
All right, let's move on to another figure who instilled fear in the hearts of his enemies, Attila the Hun, also known as the Scourge of God.
Yeah, Attila was a fierce warrior king who led the Huns on a series of devastating raids across Europe.
They were known for their brutality, weren't they?
Yeah, they were incredibly fierce warriors, and they struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. And Attila himself was a ruthless leader who demanded tribute from the Roman Empire.
And he actually threatened to sack Rome itself, didn't he?
Yeah, he led his army right up to the gates of Rome in 452 CE, but he ultimately decided to spare the city, possibly because of a plea from Pope Leo III, or maybe because of a plague that was sweeping through his ranks.
So even though his empire dissolved pretty quickly after his death, he had a huge impact on the late Roman Empire.
Definitely, his invasions weakened the Western Roman Empire and contributed to its eventual collapse. He was a force of chaos and destruction, a real game changer in a time of already great upheaval.
All right, finally, let's wrap up with the figure who's central to the founding of the United States, George Washington.
Ah, Washington, a true icon of American history.
Yeah, he was more than just a military leader. He was a statesman, a politician, and a symbol of American independence.
Absolutely. His leadership during the Revolutionary War was crucial to the colonists' victory. He held the Continental Army together through some incredibly tough times, and he made some really smart strategic decisions.
Like the daring crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776.
Exactly. That was a bold move that surprised the Hessians and gave the Americans a much-needed victory. And beyond his military achievements, Washington was also instrumental in shaping the new American government.
Yeah, he presided over the Constitutional Convention, and then he served as the first president of the United States.
Exactly. And he set a lot of important precedents for future presidents, like the two-term limit and the idea of civilian control of the military.
So not just a great military leader, but a true founding father of the United States.
Absolutely. A figure who embodies the ideals of American democracy.
Wow. So we've covered a lot of ground today, from ancient conquerors to revolutionary leaders.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how these individuals shaped the course of history.
They all had their own unique approaches to leadership and warfare, but they were all incredibly impactful in their own ways.
What's really interesting is that while their contexts and methods were so different, there are still some common threads that run through their stories.
Like what?
Well, they were all incredibly driven and ambitious. They had a clear vision for what they wanted to achieve, and they were willing to take risks to make it happen.
And they were all masters of strategy. They knew how to think ahead and outmaneuver their opponents.
Exactly. And they were all incredibly resilient. They faced setbacks and challenges, but they never gave up on their goals.
So I guess the question is, what can we learn from these figures?
That's a great question. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we can apply to our own lives, whether we're leading a team, starting a business, or just trying to achieve our personal goals. These historical figures can teach us about the importance of vision, strategy, resilience, and determination.
I think you're right, and maybe it's worth thinking about which of these leaders resonates with you the most and why.
Yeah, which one speaks to your own values and aspirations?
It's an interesting question to ponder. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure. Until next time.
See you.
All right, so welcome everyone to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're tackling something that I think a lot of people have been thinking about a lot recently, which is traditional education becoming obsolete?
Becoming obsolete.
And, we've gotten a lot of really interesting stuff from you all.
Yeah.
And, really our mission here is to kind of like go through it all, pull out the key takeaways, and, kind of understand, the different perspectives that people have on this.
Yeah.
And really try to understand what it all means for how we learn in the modern world.
Absolutely. I mean, the sources you've sent in, I think, really highlight, a system that's really under pressure right now.
Yeah.
From rapid technological advancements to, evolving societal needs, and a growing chorus of, dissatisfaction, I think, with how things are.
Yeah.
So it's a question that has real implications for all of us,
Absolutely. And so when we talk about traditional education in this context, we're talking about that model that we're all pretty familiar with. Brick and mortar classroom, standardized curriculum that's designed to be taught to everyone.
Yeah.
And delivered by a teacher, leading instruction from the front.
Yeah.
And this is a system that's been, the bedrock of education for generations. But it finds itself kind of at a crossroads, I think.
Yeah.
In our digital age.
In the digital age.
And I think that there's this real tension between this established structure and the very different demands of today's world.
Exactly.
So to understand where we are, I think we have to go back to the beginning and kind of figure out, like, where did this all come from?
Right.
Where did this traditional approach to education originate?
Well, I think what's fascinating to think about is that the foundations of traditional education as we know it were really laid during the Industrial Revolution, right? You had this massive need to prepare large numbers of people for factory work, and also to participate in civic life.
Right.
So, the aims were very practical, right? To instill discipline, ensure kind of a baseline level of literacy and numeracy across the population, and to socialize children into shared cultural norms. So you have a system that was designed for, mass production and basic skills that now faces a world that really demands personalized learning and, complex problem solving.
Right.
So it's a fundamental shift in what is needed.
Right. It's about creating a functional workforce and a unified citizenry.
Exactly.
For this new industrial era.
Yeah.
And, you can almost visualize it, like the hierarchical structure.
Yeah.
The teachers are the source of knowledge. The students absorb that knowledge.
Yeah.
And then they're tested on it to make sure that they retained it.
Tested on it.
It's almost like it mirrors the factory line in a way.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like a microcosm of order, The classroom with its fixed schedules, the ringing bells, the standardized textbooks. And then, of course, higher education stepped in to provide more specialized training for various professions.
Right.
Cementing the idea that formal credentials were the primary pathway to success. And this system undeniably served its purpose for a long time, drove significant economic and societal progress throughout the 19th and 20th centuries.
But then, Then the internet happened.
Right.
Automation became much more widespread. The world suddenly became a much smaller place because we were so interconnected.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the skills that were required in the job market started to change pretty dramatically.
It's a shift.
And, you know, as one of the articles points out, it's no longer enough to just memorize facts.
Yeah.
Because that information is often just a quick Google search away.
Right there.
You know, and what employers are really looking for is that adaptability.
Yeah.
The creativity, the digital fluency. So the question becomes, does a system that was designed for a very different time still adequately prepare us?
Prepare us for the 21st century.
For the challenges of the 21st century.
That's the central question, right? And this is where the arguments against traditional education really start to gain traction.
Yeah.
And I think the main argument, you know, is that the inherent rigidity of this system, this one-size-fits-all approach, is increasingly out of step with the needs of modern learners and the complexities of the modern world.
Exactly. And we all learn in different ways at our own pace. We all have different strengths.
Yeah.
And to think that everyone in a classroom should be learning the same thing at the same time, you know, and progressing through the material at the same rate, it just seems to ignore all of that.
Yeah.
And your sources point out that this standardization can often leave some students bored, feeling unchallenged, and it can leave other students feeling completely lost and disengaged.
Yeah.
And like it's a recipe for disaffection from learning rather than a genuine love of learning.
Yeah, and I think what's particularly striking is the criticism leveled at the curriculum itself, right?
Yeah.
While a foundation in, you know, core subjects is undeniably vital, there's a strong argument to be made that the overemphasis on rote memorization often comes at the expense of, you know, developing those crucial skills that you were talking about that employers are really looking for.
Right.
And your sources point to that 2022 World Economic Forum study, which found that 65% of children entering primary school today will end up working in jobs that don't even exist yet.
Wow.
Which is pretty remarkable to think about.
That's a huge number.
It's a huge number. And, you know, these future roles will demand skills like coding, data analysis, emotional intelligence. These are all areas where traditional education often falls short. So the thinking is, you know, are we preparing students for a world that no longer exists, rather than equipping them for the one that they're actually going to be, you know, living in?
Right. We're training kids for yesterday's challenges instead of giving them the tools to tackle tomorrow's.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, we had this issue of standardized testing.
Yeah.
Which are these, you know, often very high stakes exams.
Yeah.
That, you know, as the articles point out, only measure a very, very narrow slice of a student abilities.
Right. And it can lead to this sort of teaching to the test mentality. And this is something that Alfie Kohn, who's quoted in one of the articles, really rails against. He argues that this intense focus on testing can actually undermine the very essence of education. It turns learning from this genuine exploration, you know, into a performance, just another hurdle to clear to obtain a grade.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what we see is that students often graduate with very impressive credentials, but they lack those essential soft skills, you know, the ability to collaborate effectively, to demonstrate resilience, or to think with an entrepreneurial mindset.
And these are the things that employers are really looking for now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then if we zoom out even further, you know, we have this question of the sheer investment of time and resources that traditional education demands. You know, you're talking about, you know, 12 years of, you know, of compulsory schooling.
At least.
You know, followed by potentially, you know, another 4 years of college.
Yeah.
Or even more.
Or more.
And it really begs the question of whether all of that time is really being used in the most effective way.
And are we front-loading education too much?
Right.
You know, into these first 2 decades of life when really we should be thinking about lifelong learning.
Yeah, and it's a significant commitment of time and, let's be honest, a significant commitment of money as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And the articles make a really compelling argument about the opportunity cost of all of that.
Yeah.
You know, what else could students be doing with those years?
Exactly.
You know, pursuing their passions, gaining work experience.
Gaining real-world experience.
Engaging in hands-on projects. You know, these are all things that could potentially be far more beneficial in the long run.
Yeah.
And in this era of, you know, lifelong learning, as you said, you know, this model of front-loading education in the first, you know, 18 to 22 years of life.
Yeah.
it just seems increasingly out of sync
It just doesn't make sense anymore.
with the reality that, we need to be constantly updating our skills throughout our lives.
And this is where I think the impact of technology is undeniable. We've seen this emergence of online learning platforms that have democratized access to information and skill development in a way that we've never seen before.
Yeah.
Your sources mentioned platforms like Coursera, Khan Academy, YouTube,
Yeah.
which are all offering incredibly high-quality educational content, often for free or at a very low cost, and accessible at the individual's own pace.
Yeah.
So it's really, the breadth and depth of resources that are now available outside the traditional classroom is really quite remarkable.
It's impossible to ignore the example, that they provide, which is, a teenager in 2025 could be, mastering Python programming through a free online tutorial, much faster than they might in a traditional high school computer science course.
Yeah, and they might even get a better education doing it that way.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And, with the rise of AI tools, sophisticated chatbots, adaptive learning software, the potential for truly personalized education experiences outside of the traditional classroom are becoming, a reality.
Absolutely.
And so, this forces us to ask, if knowledge is so readily accessible, if skills could be acquired in so many different ways, then what role does that traditional structure really play?
What is its unique role?
Yeah, what's the unique value proposition there?
And I think this has led to, the rise of a lot of alternative education models.
Yeah.
Which is exciting to see.
Absolutely. Your sources highlight homeschooling,
Yeah.
which has seen a surge in popularity in recent years.
A huge surge.
The National Home Education Research Institute reported over 10% annual growth in the U.S. between 2020 and 2023.
Yeah, and this is driven by, a lot of different factors. Obviously, the pandemic played a role. It forced a lot of families to try homeschooling.
Right.
But I think also there's a growing sense of dissatisfaction with traditional public schools.
Yeah.
And, technology has made it easier than ever to create a structured learning environment at home with access to virtual classrooms and all these amazing online resources.
Yeah.
But then you have unschooling, which is even more radical departure from traditional norms.
Yeah. As the articles describe it, unschooling is essentially a rejection of any formal curriculum.
It's child-led learning.
Right.
It's based on the idea that, children are naturally curious and they will learn best when they're allowed to pursue their own interests.
Yeah. And it's deeply rooted in the philosophy of people like John Holt, who argued that this, intrinsic curiosity is the most powerful driver of deep learning.
And so while it might be a more niche approach, the idea of interest-driven education is certainly resonating with people.
Absolutely.
Particularly this generation that's grown up, with very personalized digital experiences.
Exactly. They're used to curating their own content.
Yeah.
They're used to having things, tailored to their interests.
Right.
So it makes sense that would spill over into education.
Yeah. And then, beyond these home-based alternatives, we've seen this explosion in online learning platforms.
Oh, yeah.
And these aren't just replicating traditional courses in a digital format.
Right. They're offering micro-credentials, specialized certifications, even full degree programs. And they're doing it in a way that's much more flexible and affordable and more relevant to specific career paths.
Right.
LinkedIn reported in 2024 that 57% of professionals had taken an online course specifically for career advancement.
Wow.
So this signals a real shift towards, just-in-time learning, acquiring the skills you need exactly when you need them.
Yeah.
Rather than, front-loading it all at the beginning of your life.
Right. And then, you also have the growing emphasis on vocational training programs and apprenticeships.
Right.
And the articles, point to countries like Germany and Switzerland.
Where it's much more ingrained in the culture.
Yeah.
There's this long tradition of, hands-on practical training.
Yeah.
And what's key here is that these models often lead to jobs much more quickly and with significantly less debt.
Yeah.
Which is a stark contrast to traditional four-year university degrees, which, as you mentioned, can be very expensive and don't always translate directly into jobs.
Right. And, and even in the U.S., we're seeing a rise in initiatives like Year Up and, coding boot camps like General Assembly that, condense this training into much shorter, more intensive periods.
Yeah.
Really catering to this idea that people want to gain skills quickly and
Well,
get into the workforce.
It's also interesting to see how even within traditional education, there are experiments happening.
Yeah.
They mentioned things like project-based learning and the Montessori philosophy.
So these are real attempts to, introduce more student-centered and engaging approaches.
Yeah.
Project-based learning, for example, it replaces those passive lectures with, students actually tackling real-world problems.
Right.
Which, helps to foster collaboration and creativity. And the example of High Tech High in California really showcases the potential of this model to produce graduates who are ready, for these innovative fields.
Yeah.
So it really suggests that, the future of education isn't necessarily about obsolescence, but rather evolution.
Right. But let's not write traditional education's obituary just yet.
No.
Because the articles also make a compelling case for why it still holds a lot of value.
Absolutely.
And one of the key strengths that comes up over and over again is the provision of structure.
Yeah, that's a really important point. While flexibility is great, that predictability and those established routines of a traditional classroom can provide a really vital foundation for learners, particularly for younger students. The OECD in 2023, found that students in more structured environments actually tend to outperform their peers in self-paced settings when it comes to things like persistence and academic achievement.
Interesting. And then there's that undeniably important social aspect.
Yeah.
Schools are not just places where you learn academic subjects.
Right.
They're also places where, children learn how to interact with each other.
Yeah, they learn how to collaborate.
Yeah.
They learn how to develop empathy. They learn how to navigate conflict.
Right.
Which are all really, really important skills. And the American Psychological Association has done a lot of research on this. And they found that in-person interaction during those formative years is crucial for developing emotional intelligence.
Yeah. And then we can't overlook the issue of equity. The articles make the point that public education is designed to provide universal access to learning, regardless of a child's background.
Yeah, and that's a really important counter-argument to some of the, the criticisms that are leveled against traditional education. While there are disparities between wealthier and poorer school districts, the ideal of universal education is still a cornerstone of a just and equitable society.
Yeah.
And this is something that online learning struggles with because it inherently relies on access to technology and reliable internet.
Yeah.
Which is not something that everyone has.
Right. And UNESCO estimates that there are still millions of children worldwide who lack access to basic schooling.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
The articles also talk about how traditional education plays a role in providing a shared cultural framework. That standardized curriculum, teaching everyone the same history, the same literature.
Yeah.
It helps to foster a sense of collective identity within a society. Some people might criticize that as promoting conformity.
Yeah.
But there's also that argument that it provides a common ground.
A shared vocabulary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, at the higher education level, universities are still these hubs of research and innovation.
Absolutely.
They're pushing the boundaries of knowledge in ways that are harder to achieve through, self-directed learning.
Right.
Or even these short-term programs.
And they're also producing the vast majority of, PhDs who are the ones who are doing that research and driving innovation.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the credential.
The credentials.
Even with all this talk about alternative pathways and skills-based hiring, the articles point out that employers and institutions still really value those traditional degrees and diplomas.
Yeah. The National Association of Colleges and Employers found that in 2024, 78% of hiring managers still preferred candidates with traditional credentials.
Wow. So it really hasn't changed much.
No, not really.
So if traditional education isn't totally obsolete, and it still offers, some value.
It does.
But it also has its limitations.
It does.
Where does that leave us?
Well, I think the articles really point to this hybrid future, where we take the best of both worlds and we blend them together.
It seems like the articles are saying that traditional education isn't going away. It's transforming.
It's evolving.
Right.
Yeah.
So, imagine learning environments with AI tutors, that can provide truly personalized support.
Yeah.
Imagine those high-stakes standardized tests being replaced by portfolios that showcase, real-world projects.
Yeah.
And imagine learning not being confined to a specific period of life, But, it's ongoing.
Lifelong learning.
Right, exactly.
And I think technology is going to play a central role in all of this. Virtual reality, for example, can create these immersive and engaging learning experiences. Blockchain can be used to validate skills that are acquired from a variety of sources.
Yeah.
So you're not just relying on, that one degree from that one institution.
Right.
And, even the physical school buildings themselves can become these community learning hubs.
Yeah.
Offering programs for people of all ages.
Yeah.
From early childhood education to adult retraining, and cultural enrichment programs. So they really become these centers for lifelong learning.
Right.
And I think in this environment, the role of the teacher changes.
Yeah.
They become less of the sage on the stage and more of a guide, helping students navigate this really complex learning landscape.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing glimpses of this in, different parts of the world. Finland, for example, has been very successful at integrating technology into a flexible national curriculum while maintaining very high standards for teacher training and a strong commitment to equity.
And in the U.S., there's this growing movement towards competency-based education, where student progress is measured by the mastery of specific skills.
Yeah.
Rather than just how much time they spent in the classroom. Seat.
Right.
And even universities are adapting.
Yeah.
Arizona State University, for example, has partnered with online platforms to offer more affordable degree options.
Right.
But of course, this transition won't be without its challenges.
Right.
Funding will be a big one.
Well, absolutely.
There's going to be resistance to change from entrenched institutions.
People don't like change.
Right. Yeah. And then there's the issue of equity, making sure that all students have access to these new opportunities.
Yeah.
And that we're not leaving anyone behind.
Right. And then there's the question of, as learning becomes more personalized and fragmented, how do we maintain those shared values and that sense of social cohesion?
Yeah. These are really important questions. So to bring it all back around, is traditional education as we know it becoming obsolete?
Right.
I think the answer is not yet.
Not yet.
But it's at a turning point.
It is.
We've seen that it has its strengths.
It does.
It provides structure, it fosters socialization, it aims for universal access. But we've also seen that it has its limitations.
It does.
It can be rigid.
Yeah.
It can be irrelevant. It can be inefficient.
Absolutely.
And, the rise of these alternative models shows that learning can happen outside the classroom.
Yeah.
And that it can often complement or even challenge traditional systems. So I think the real question isn't if traditional education will survive.
Yeah.
It's how it will adapt.
Exactly.
And how it will transform to meet the needs of 21st century learners.
And that process of adaptation is going to be really crucial in shaping the future of learning.
Yeah. And so this kind of leaves us with a final thought.
Yeah.
Considering all the things we've talked about, all the challenges and the opportunities, how will this evolving landscape of education really shape not just how we learn, but who we become?
Who we become.
As individuals and as a society.
That's a really big question.
It is. It's something to think about.
Yeah.
As we all continue on our own learning journeys.
Absolutely.
And watch this future of education unfold.
It's going to be an interesting ride.
It is. It's amazing to think about, the impact of movement across borders. The flow of people and ideas and ambition and how it shapes our world. History is full of stories of immigrants. They're at the forefront of innovation and progress. And today, we are going to take a deep dive into the stories of some truly remarkable people. These people crossed borders, and they left an undeniable mark on society.
Yeah. For this deep dive, we've been looking at an article. This article details the journeys and achievements of several highly successful immigrants. So our aim is to go a little deeper, not just what they did, but, maybe some of those unique perspectives. What drove their extraordinary contributions?
Okay, so our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to gain a clear understanding of the impact that immigrants have made, and hopefully we'll uncover some surprising aspects of their stories. And we're not going to get lost in a sea of minor details.
Yeah, we want to keep it high level.
So let's jump right in. And there's really no better place to start than with a name that's synonymous with American industry, Andrew Carnegie.
Right. So Carnegie, he arrives in the U.S. from Scotland in 1848. He was just 13 years old. Came with his family. They were looking for, better opportunities. And what strikes me right away is the difference in his early circumstances. He was working as a bobbin boy in a textile mill, but he goes on to build this huge empire. And to me, it just shows the potential. When someone with drive finds the right environment, anything is possible.
Absolutely. It wasn't just luck, though, was it? I mean, this guy, he had ambition and incredible work ethic. And those seem to be recurring themes in his rise with Carnegie Steel. I mean, think about it. This company became the backbone of America's industrial might. I guess my question is, what was it about America at that time that allowed someone like Carnegie to achieve that monumental success?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the late 19th century, the U.S. was experiencing this period of rapid industrial expansion. And there was huge demand for steel. They needed it to build railroads, bridges, skyscrapers. So Carnegie, he had the vision to capitalize on this growth, but he also had this remarkable ability to organize. And to manage these vast industrial operations, he adopted the Bessemer process, which I think, revolutionized steel production. So it wasn't just hard work. It was about innovation and efficiency on a massive scale.
And his story, it doesn't end with building this business, does it? He's actually one of history's greatest philanthropists.
Yeah.
What do you think was the motivation behind that shift?
It is fascinating. So after accumulating all of this wealth, Carnegie, he developed this philosophy that wealthy people, they have this moral obligation to redistribute their surplus, to make society better. So he uses his fortune to establish libraries, support educational institutions, and to fund scientific research. And I wonder if, starting with nothing, if that fueled a desire in him to create opportunities for others. I don't know, it makes you think maybe his experience as an immigrant gave him a unique perspective on things like social mobility and access to knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. So from the tangible world of steel, we're going to shift gears a little. We're going to go to the realm of theoretical physics. And we're going to talk about Albert Einstein. He was born in Germany, but he immigrated to the U.S. in 1933. And this was under some pretty difficult circumstances. He was fleeing the Nazi regime.
Yeah. It's a reminder, isn't it? When you lose talent due to persecution, it can have devastating consequences for a nation. But then it provides this huge gain for the place of refuge. So when Einstein arrived in the U.S., he brought with him, this mind that would change our understanding of the universe. His theories of relativity and his work in quantum mechanics were revolutionary. And it's interesting because he did a lot of this groundbreaking work before even coming to the U.S. So that highlights, how important it is to nurture intellectual freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921. But beyond his achievements in science, Einstein became a very powerful voice for human rights and for peace. Do you think there's a connection between his experience as a refugee and his advocacy work?
I think it's very likely. He saw firsthand the destructive power of intolerance. He knew how important these fundamental human rights were. So I think Einstein's moral authority was amplified because of his personal history. He understood that peace was fragile. He understood that it was necessary to speak out against injustice. So, it just shows how personal experience can inform your engagement in society.
Okay, let's talk about someone who is shaping our technological landscape right now. And that's Elon Musk. Born in South Africa, he came to the U.S. by way of Canada for his education, and his career has been one audacious venture after another. So what makes his approach to innovation so different?
Well, what I think is interesting about Musk is that he is willing to tackle these huge problems. And these problems, they span across these diverse fields all at the same time. So think about it. PayPal, it revolutionized online payments. Then he moves on to electric vehicles with Tesla. And his goal there is sustainable transportation. And then with SpaceX, he's literally aiming for the stars. He wants to make space travel more accessible. So this level of ambition, this scope, it's very rare. And maybe coming from a different cultural context allows him to see possibilities that other people just don't see, people entrenched in existing industries.
Yeah, it's like he isn't limited by conventional wisdom at all.
Yeah.
And the impact is undeniable. I mean, look at Tesla. They pushed the entire auto industry toward electric vehicles. And then SpaceX, they're changing the economics of space exploration. So what do you see as the driving force behind this pursuit of impossible goals?
It seems to me that it's a few things. He has a deep understanding of engineering principles. He has a very high tolerance for risk, and he has this powerful vision for the future. But he doesn't just iterate on existing technologies. He completely rethinks entire systems. And that means challenging assumptions and embracing radical new approaches.
Okay, so speaking of rethinking fundamental systems, let's talk about Sergey Brin. He was born in Moscow, Russia, and he immigrated to the U.S. as a child with his family. And they were looking for refuge from anti-Semitic policies in the Soviet Union. So how do you think that experience shaped his drive and his vision?
Well, experiencing prejudice and a lack of freedom at a young age can be motivating. Arriving in a country that promises more opportunity, more intellectual freedom, it probably instilled a deep appreciation for those values. So when Brin co-founded Google with Larry Page in 1998, they democratized access to information like we've never seen before. And you have to wonder, was that desire to make information accessible? Was that a reaction to the restrictions he experienced earlier in life?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Google has changed how we learn, how we communicate, how we navigate the world. I mean, it's really hard to imagine life without it. What's the biggest takeaway from Google's impact in the context of this conversation about immigrants?
I think it really shows how the pursuit of freedom and opportunity can lead to innovation. And that innovation benefits billions of people around the world. Brin's story shows us that when you welcome talent, when you nurture talent, the potential for groundbreaking achievements is huge.
Okay, let's go back in time a bit. We're going to talk about another pivotal figure in technology, Nikola Tesla. Born in Serbia, she immigrated to the U.S. in 1884, and he made groundbreaking contributions to electrical engineering. So what was so revolutionary about his work?
Tesla's work was completely transformative. His development of alternating current, AC power, as opposed to Thomas Edison's direct current, DC, it was fundamental to the way we distribute electricity today. It powers our modern world. AC is more efficient for long-distance transmission. And that was crucial for electrifying entire cities and regions. But he also pioneered advancements in wireless communication and even early forms of robotics. His mind was constantly coming up with these innovative solutions to complex problems.
He was way ahead of his time. But, our sources note that despite all of his contributions, he faced some significant financial difficulties. What does this tell us about the relationship between innovation and the practical realities of the market?
It's complicated. Sometimes a groundbreaking idea isn't understood right away, or it's not commercially viable. And I think Tesla's story highlights the challenges that inventors can face, trying to secure funding, trying to navigate the business world. And this is even when their inventions have the potential to revolutionize industries. So it just underscores the importance of not only innovation, but also the systems that support it and recognize it.
Okay, so now we're going to move into the world of politics and diplomacy. And we're going to talk about Madeleine Albright. She was born in Czechoslovakia and immigrated to the U.S. after World War II. And eventually she becomes the first female U.S. Secretary of State in 1997.
So what were some of the defining aspects of her career? Well, Albright's career shows a deep understanding of international relations, and she was committed to democracy and human rights. And I think her experience as a refugee probably shaped her views on the importance of American leadership around the world and the need to stand up to tyranny. Her journey is incredible. She went through academia and the diplomatic corps all the way to the highest levels of government. It's a testament to her intelligence, her determination, and it really speaks to the opportunities that are available in the U.S.
And she was the first female Secretary of State. That was a big milestone. What kind of impact do you think that had?
Well, I think it inspired women and girls all over the world. It showed them that they can achieve anything. There are no limits, even in public service. And it also brought a different perspective to foreign policy discussions. Although her policy stances, they were really driven by her deep understanding of geopolitics.
Okay, so let's shift gears again. We're going to go to the world of media now. And we're going to discuss Joseph Pulitzer. He was born in Hungary, and he became a major force in American journalism. What were some of his key innovations?
Pulitzer really transformed journalism. He championed investigative reporting. He believed that the press had this crucial role to play, to hold power accountable and to inform the public. He also emphasized clear, concise writing, engaging storytelling to reach more people, and he was a big advocate for media ethics, even during the sensationalism of yellow journalism that was happening at the time.
And his legacy continues today through the Pulitzer Prizes. What does the lasting impact of these awards tell us about him?
I think it shows his influence on journalism, like what we consider to be excellent in journalism, literature, and the arts. The Pulitzer Prizes are this reminder that quality and integrity in these fields are important, and those were principles that Pulitzer championed.
All right, let's move on to a more recent example of entrepreneurial success. Pierre Omidyar. He was born in France to Iranian parents, and in 1995 he founded eBay. So what was so revolutionary about this platform?
Well, eBay created this global online marketplace. It connected buyers and sellers in a way that had never been done before. So it democratized commerce. Individuals and small businesses, they could reach customers all over the world. It really fostered a sense of community. And it created these brand new economic opportunities for millions of people. And it's a great example of how a simple idea, when paired with the right technology, can have a huge impact.
And his impact goes beyond eBay too, right?
Yeah, he's become a philanthropist. He focuses on things like governance, media, and technology. So he is committed to using his success to address these larger societal challenges.
Okay, now let's look at someone who championed a different kind of value. John Muir. Born in Scotland, he came to the U.S. in 1849, and he became a leading advocate for the conservation movement. So what drove him to advocate for the natural world?
Well, Muir had this deep spiritual connection to nature. And he really understood its value. To him, the wilderness wasn't just a resource, it was something to be cherished and protected. His writings, his advocacy work, it was all instrumental in creating national parks, like Yosemite. And these parks preserve these natural treasures for future generations.
So he wasn't just appreciating nature, he was working to protect it long term. How important was his contribution to the environmental movement?
I would say he laid the foundation for the modern conservation movement in the U.S. His ideas and activism changed public opinion, and it changed government policy. They started to see how important it was to preserve wilderness. So the National Park Service owes a lot to his early efforts.
All right, last but not least, let's talk about Indra Nooyi. She came to the U.S. from India for higher education, and she eventually became the CEO of PepsiCo. What were some of her achievements during her time there?
Nooyi was focused on diversifying PepsiCo's products. She wanted to include healthier options. She also placed a strong emphasis on sustainability initiatives. She knew that the consumer landscape was changing, and she understood the importance of corporate responsibility. And her success as a woman of color leading a global corporation was a powerful symbol. It showed what can be achieved through talent and hard work, regardless of your background.
So we've talked about 10 remarkable individuals. What are some common themes that we see in their stories?
Well, we see resilience, overcoming adversity. There's a strong drive for innovation. And they all have this incredible work ethic. And most of them have this ambition to make a contribution to their adopted homeland and to the world. And a lot of them were looking for more freedom and opportunity. And that seems to have played a role in their ability to be successful.
And it's amazing to think about the impact that they've all had, from business to science to technology to politics to media and the environment. It really shows how diverse the talents and perspectives are that immigrants bring to a society.
Absolutely. These stories show us the value of immigration and how it leads to progress and prosperity across every sector. And hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this important part of our history.
All right, so it's clear that these 10 people have left their mark on the world. They've shaped how we live, how we think, how we interact with our surroundings.
And this leads us to a final thought. Think about the flow of talent and ideas across borders. It's happening right now. So what innovations, what advancements are we going to see because of people who are choosing to build their lives in new places? The story of immigration isn't over, it's still being written. And it's incredibly important to our collective future.
Very well said. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We got a really interesting set of sources from you for this one. Looks like you're wrestling with a pretty big question. What is the meaning of life?
Yeah, the meaning of life. I mean, who hasn't thought about that at some point?
Exactly. It seems like every culture, every belief system has grappled with this question.
Absolutely. And you've sent us a pretty diverse collection of sources, too, to explore this. I mean, we've got religious texts, philosophical arguments, even some scientific perspectives in here.
It's amazing. I'm really curious to see what we can uncover together.
Me too.
So what we want to do in this deep dive is really dig into these sources and see what insights they offer about this age-old question.
Right. I mean, no one expects us to come up with a definitive answer.
If there even is one.
Right, exactly. But maybe we can at least shed some light on the different ways people have tried to understand the whole point of being here. Why are we doing all this?
Yeah, exactly. Have you ever just stopped and wondered, wait, what is this all for?
All the time.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's start with some of the religious perspectives you sent us.
Sounds good.
It's interesting how many of these traditions offer a sort of built-in meaning system. Like, this is why you're here, this is what you're supposed to do.
Right. There's often this idea that we're connected to something much bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. Like in Christianity, for example. Yeah. A lot of the sources you sent highlight this idea of a personal relationship with God and following the teachings of Jesus.
Right, like living a righteous life and seeking salvation.
And it's not just about, abstract belief. There's a lot of emphasis on putting these teachings into action, like showing love and compassion, serving others.
Exactly. It's like you were saying, it's a way of life.
Yeah. And some of the key verses you included really highlight that, like the one from Genesis about being created in God's image. And then, of course, there's that incredibly powerful message in Mark about loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself.
The great commandment, right?
Yes, that's the one. And the ultimate goal, as your sources point out, is eternal life in heaven.
Right. So there's the sense of purpose that extends beyond our earthly existence.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about Islam. Your sources on Islam really emphasize the worship of Allah and following his guidance.
Right. The Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad.
Exactly. And you even included a specific verse from the Quran that really captures this core idea. And I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me.
Quran 51.56, yeah. It's pretty direct, isn't it?
It is. And there's this strong emphasis on submission to God's will and the belief that this life is a test, a preparation for the afterlife.
So, like Christianity, there's a focus on righteousness and right action, but the way it's framed is a bit different. It's about submitting to a divine plan.
That's a good point. Now let's move to something completely different. Hinduism. Your sources on Hinduism describe this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, samsara, and the ultimate goal of achieving liberation from that cycle, which is moksha.
Yeah, it's a very different way of thinking about existence compared to the Abrahamic traditions.
Right. And what's interesting is that your sources also outline these 4 major aims in life: dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. It's almost like a journey,
Tell me more about these 4 aims.
Well, dharma is like your righteous duty, what you're supposed to do in this life. Artha is about achieving material prosperity, and kama is about pleasure and enjoyment.
And those all lead to moksha.
Exactly. It's like fulfilling these different aspects of human experience ultimately leads to this state of liberation.
Interesting. So it acknowledges those earthly desires, but also points beyond them.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating. Okay, so then we have Buddhism. And here, the focus is on overcoming suffering, dukkha.
Right. And reaching nirvana, that state of enlightenment and peace.
Right. And the path to nirvana is laid out in the 4 noble truths, which basically say, hey, suffering exists, it has a cause, but there's a way to end it.
And that way is through the Eightfold Path.
Exactly. And the Eightfold Path is all about cultivating ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom.
Right. It's a lot about inner work, about understanding the nature of reality and freeing ourselves from attachment and desire.
Yeah. It's definitely a very introspective approach. Now, the last religious perspective we have is Judaism. And here, the emphasis seems to be on fulfilling God's commandments, the mitzvot.
And tikkun olam, repairing the world.
Yes, that's a key concept. So it's not just about personal piety, but about actively making the world a better place.
Right. And your sources highlight the importance of ethical living, justice, community, and family.
Absolutely. It's about living in right relationship with God, with each other, and with the world around us. So looking back at all these religious perspectives, we see some interesting common threads, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they all offer a sense of purpose that's connected to something larger than ourselves, whether it's God, a divine plan, or a cosmic order.
And they all provide a moral framework for living. Like, here's how you're supposed to act. Here's what a good life looks like.
Right, exactly. Okay, so now we're moving into some completely different territory, right?
Yeah, let's dive into the philosophical approaches you sent. These take a very different approach to the whole meaning of life question. They're not necessarily rooted in a belief in God or a divine plan.
Right, philosophy often relies on reason and logic to grapple with these big questions.
Exactly, and the first one we'll look at is existentialism. This is where things get really interesting because existentialism basically says that life doesn't have any inherent meaning.
Whoa, that's pretty heavy stuff.
It is, but it's also kind of liberating in a way because if there's no preset meaning, then we're free to create our own.
It's like we're responsible for defining our own purpose.
Exactly. And one of your sources included this great quote from Sarkar that sums it up perfectly. Existence precedes essence. It's not that we're born with a purpose, it's that we create our purpose through our choices and actions.
I love that. Existence precedes essence. So it's not about discovering some hidden meaning out there. It's about creating meaning through the way we live.
Exactly. Okay, so now we're going even deeper down the rabbit hole with absurdism.
Okay, tell me about this one.
So, absurdism takes this idea of a meaningless universe even further. It basically says that there's this fundamental conflict between our human desire for meaning and the universe's total indifference to that desire.
Oh, that's definitely absurd.
Right. Like we're searching for answers, but the universe just doesn't care.
It's like yelling into a void.
Exactly. And one of your sources talks about Camus, the philosopher, who really explored this idea, and he uses the myth of Sisyphus as a metaphor. You know, Sisyphus, the guy who's condemned to eternally push a boulder uphill, only for it to roll back down every time.
Oh, yeah, I remember that from my philosophy classes. It's kind of a bleak image, isn't it?
It is. But what Camus is saying is that we need to embrace that absurdity. Like, yeah, life might not have an inherent meaning, but that doesn't mean we can't find joy and purpose in the living of it.
So it's not about giving up hope. It's about finding a way to live passionately, even in the face of meaninglessness.
Exactly. Okay, now let's switch gears again and talk about utilitarianism. This one takes a much more practical approach.
Okay, I'm curious about this one.
So utilitarianism is all about maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering for the greatest number of people.
So it's about making choices that lead to the best possible outcome for everyone involved.
Exactly. The ends justify the means, essentially. And some of the key thinkers in this tradition are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
Right, I've heard of those guys.
So in utilitarianism, the meaning of life comes from contributing to the overall well-being of humanity.
Interesting. So it's not about individual fulfillment, but about the collective good.
Exactly. And finally, in the philosophical realm, we have virtue ethics. This one is all about developing good character traits like courage, wisdom, and justice.
Oh, yeah, like Aristotle's ideas.
Exactly. And the goal here is eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness or flourishing. But it's not just about feeling good. It's about living a virtuous life, a life in accordance with these positive qualities.
So it's about becoming the best version of yourself.
Exactly. And Aristotle believed that living this way would lead to true fulfillment. So, as you can see, these philosophical approaches offer a really wide range of perspectives on meaning. Some, like existentialism, put the onus on the individual to create meaning, while others, like utilitarianism, focus on the collective good.
Yeah, it's fascinating how they approach it from such different angles. Okay, so where do we go from here?
Well, now we're going to shift gears one more time and look at the scientific perspective.
Okay, yeah, how does science even approach this question?
Well, science doesn't really deal with the concept of meaning in the same way that religion or philosophy do.
Right, science is all about observation, experimentation, and evidence.
Exactly. So when it comes to the meaning of life, science tends to focus more on explaining the mechanisms of life and how we got here.
So things like evolution and the origins of the universe?
Exactly. For example, the biological perspective often boils down to survival and reproduction. Like, from an evolutionary standpoint, the whole point is to pass on our genes.
Right, survival of the fittest.
Yeah. And that drive shapes a lot of our behavior, from finding food and shelter to finding mates and raising offspring.
It's fascinating to think about how our basic biological drives can influence so much of our lives.
It really is. Then you have the cosmological perspective, which zooms out and looks at our place in the vast universe.
Yeah, that can make you feel pretty small.
It can.
Yeah.
But it also makes you realize how incredible it is that we're here at all. Like we're part of this amazing cosmic story.
And some people find meaning in trying to understand that story and unraveling the mysteries of the universe.
Exactly. Now, the last scientific perspective I want to touch on is the psychological one. This is where we start to see a bit more overlap with the philosophical ideas.
Okay, how so?
Well, psychology is interested in how we experience meaning and how it impacts our well-being. And one of the most influential thinkers in this area is Viktor Frankl.
Oh, yeah, the author of Man's Search for Meaning.
Exactly. And Frankl's work is so powerful because he went through this incredibly horrific experience, the Holocaust, and yet he still found meaning.
That's really inspiring.
It is. And he came to believe that meaning can be found even in the most difficult circumstances through things like having a purpose, connecting with others, and finding meaning in suffering.
It's like finding a reason to keep going even when things are terrible.
Exactly. And one of the things Frankl talks about is this idea that we can't always choose our circumstances, but we can choose our attitude towards them. And that choice, that act of finding meaning, is what gives us strength and resilience.
Wow, that's really profound.
So even though science may not give us a definitive answer to the meaning of life question, it can offer some really valuable insights into how we as humans create and experience meaning.
And how that experience of meaning can impact our well-being.
Exactly. Okay, so now we've covered religion, philosophy, and science. What's left?
What about the personal and cultural dimensions of meaning?
Ah, yes. That's a crucial piece of the puzzle. Because ultimately, what gives one person's life meaning might be completely different for someone else.
Right. Meaning is a very individual thing. It's shaped by our unique experiences, values, and beliefs.
Exactly. Some people might find meaning in their careers, others in their relationships, others in creative pursuits, or in making a difference in the world. It's incredibly diverse.
It's like there are as many different meanings as there are people.
In a way, yeah. And then, of course, there's the cultural dimension. Your sources did a great job of contrasting Western and Eastern perspectives on meaning.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, Western cultures tend to emphasize individualism and self-expression, like finding your own unique path, pursuing your passions, being true to yourself.
Okay, so meaning is often seen as something you create for yourself.
Exactly. Whereas in Eastern cultures, there's often a greater emphasis on family, community, and tradition.
So meaning might come from fulfilling your role in society or contributing to the well-being of your family.
Exactly. It's a different way of framing the whole question of meaning. So as we wrap up this deep dive, the main takeaway I'm seeing is that there is no one-size-fits-all answer to the meaning of life question.
Right, it's way too complex for a simple answer.
Exactly. We've seen how different religions, philosophies, and even scientific disciplines approach it from totally different angles. And ultimately, it seems like the meaning we find in life is often a reflection of our own individual beliefs, values, and experiences.
And our cultural context.
Absolutely. So listener, as you reflect on everything we've discussed today, I encourage you to ask yourself, what resonates most deeply with you? What gives your life meaning? And how can you live in a way that reflects those values and brings you a sense of purpose? Because in the end, that's what this whole quest for meaning is all about.
Thanks for guiding us through this incredible journey.
Of course, it was my pleasure. And thank you, listener, for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Until next time.
See you then.
Okay, so I think everyone listening to this has felt this at some point, right? Like, you're learning English, you're putting in the work, and you're making progress. You can understand a lot, maybe even have like a pretty decent conversation.
Yeah.
But there's still this gap,
Right.
This feeling that those who speak English really fluently and naturally, they're just operating on a whole other level.
Absolutely, and it can be frustrating.
Like there's this invisible barrier you just can't seem to break through.
For sure. And so many learners hit that point where they feel like they're putting in the effort, but not quite reaching that level of, really effortless and natural communication.
Totally. And so that's exactly what we're diving into today. What is it that truly sets apart those fluent speakers? We've been digging into some really fascinating research on this, and it really is like getting an insider's look at what makes the difference.
Yeah, and I think what's really helpful about the sources we've looked at is that they move beyond just, the standard advice. They actually unpack the specific habits, the mindset, the way fluent speakers actually approach the language.
Right, exactly. It's not just about memorizing more words or, drilling grammar rules over and over.
Exactly.
It's about understanding how they engage with English on a much deeper level. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down those key strategies, those approaches that you can start using right away.
I love that. Let's jump in.
Okay, so the first thing that kept coming up in our research was this idea of thinking in English. And I know at first glance that might sound, kind of obvious, right? But there's actually a very specific way fluent speakers do this that has a huge impact. Yeah. It goes way beyond just like knowing the English translation of a word in your native language.
Yeah, it's about making a mental shift.
Yeah.
So instead of constantly translating in your head, you're actually processing thoughts and ideas directly in English.
Right, so it's like bypassing that whole translation step, which honestly can be super mentally exhausting.
Totally. And you know what? It actually affects how you speak too. When you're constantly translating, it often leads to this kind of stilted or unnatural way of speaking.
Yeah, you don't have that natural flow.
Right, exactly. So thinking directly in English helps with that. It makes your speech more fluid, more spontaneous.
Okay, so how do you actually start doing this? The sources we looked at had some really practical tips. One of the simplest ones, believe it or not, is just labeling the objects around you in English.
Okay.
So like instead of just seeing a table and thinking mesa in your head, you actively think table.
I see.
And it sounds simple, but doing this consistently begins to build those direct connections in your brain between the object and the English word without needing to go through that translation process.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like building a new pathway in your brain.
Exactly. And another tip was using English for those little everyday decisions. Yeah. Like when you're choosing what to eat or what to wear. Instead of thinking it through in your native language, you try to make those choices in English.
Got it. So like if I'm trying to decide between an apple and a banana, I'd actually say to myself, should I have an apple or a banana in English?
Right. It might feel a little silly at first, but it's training your brain to think in English in those everyday moments.
I like that.
And then building on that, there's the idea of having an internal monologue in English.
Oh.
So as you're going about your day, you're kind of narrating your actions, your thoughts, everything in English. Like, okay, now I'm going to make some coffee. I need to get the mug, grind the beans.
It's interesting.
You're basically just talking to yourself in English, which keeps the language active in your mind, even when you're not actively studying or practicing.
I can see how that would be super helpful.
Now, here's a tip that I found particularly interesting. The sources strongly advise against translating whenever possible. So if you come across a word you don't know, instead of immediately looking it up or thinking of the equivalent in your native language, they encourage you to try to figure it out from context or use other English words you already know to express the idea.
That's a good challenge.
It's tough, but it forces you to think and problem solve within the English language itself.
Yeah, it makes you more resourceful.
Exactly. And finally, there's this fun one. Having imaginary conversations in English.
Imaginary conversations.
Yeah, like when you're alone, just play out different scenarios in your head, practice how you might respond to certain questions or situations, you know, that kind of thing.
That's actually a great idea.
Yeah.
You can practice without the pressure of a real conversation.
Right. And the more you do it, the more comfortable and natural you'll become at forming sentences and expressing yourself in English. So the big takeaway here is that thinking in English isn't about knowing tons of vocabulary from the get-go.
Right.
It's about rewiring your brain to actually process the language in a different way.
I like that. Changing your thinking to change your speaking.
Now, the second big secret that we uncovered is something that I think a lot of learners struggle with, and that's speaking every day.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Especially if you don't have like a readily available conversation partner. But the good news is you don't actually need one to get in some really effective speaking practice.
That's encouraging to hear.
The sources we looked at highlighted a bunch of solo techniques that you can do anywhere, anytime.
I'm all ears.
So one that really stood out to me was shadowing.
Shadowing. Okay.
Have you ever tried that? It's basically listening to native English speakers and repeating what they say as they're saying it, trying to like mimic their pronunciation, their rhythm, everything.
Oh, okay. I have heard of that.
It's really cool because it kind of taps into those mirror neurons in your brain, helping you naturally adopt the sounds and patterns of native speech.
Interesting. So it's not just about understanding the words, but also about absorbing like the musicality of how they speak.
Exactly. Another technique, and this one can be a little intimidating at first, is recording yourself speaking.
Oh, yeah. I've tried that before, and it can be a little cringeworthy listening back.
Totally. But it's honestly one of the best ways to pinpoint those areas where your pronunciation needs some work. You can really hear those sounds that you're struggling with, or maybe where your intonation is a little off.
Yeah, I guess you can't really hide from it when you're listening back to yourself.
Right. It's like having that objective feedback. And then, of course, there's the classic technique of reading aloud.
Oh, yeah. I do that sometimes.
It's a great way to practice pronunciation and fluency in a more controlled environment. And you can read anything. Books, articles, even like scripts for plays or movies.
So it gets you comfortable with saying the words out loud.
Yeah.
Even if you're not necessarily having a conversation.
Exactly. Now, going back to speaking alone, another thing that was mentioned was just describing what you're doing as you do it in English.
Yeah.
So like if you're cooking dinner, you're literally saying, okay, now I'm chopping the vegetables. I'm adding the spices. And you can even take it a step further and tell yourself stories in English. It's like that internal monologue, but you're making it audible.
So you're really just getting comfortable with producing the sounds and forming sentences.
Exactly. And the beauty of all these techniques is that you can do them literally anywhere, anytime. So for anyone listening who's thinking, oh, I don't have anyone to practice with, well, now you've got a whole bunch of ways to start speaking more.
That's so helpful.
Now, the third secret we want to talk about is something that I think sometimes gets overlooked, but it's so crucial for sounding natural and fluent, and that's mastering pronunciation and intonation.
Right. It's not just about the words themselves, it's also about how you deliver them.
Absolutely. You could have perfect grammar and a massive vocabulary, but if your pronunciation or your intonation is off, it can make it really difficult for people to understand you.
Totally. It's like, when you hear someone speaking your language with a strong accent,
Yeah.
you might be able to get the gist of what they're saying, but it takes extra effort
Right, and it might not sound as natural or fluent. So what are some practical things we can do to improve this?
Well, one of the best things you can do is actively listen to native speakers and really pay attention to how they pronounce words.
Okay, so just really focus on the sounds.
But also pay attention to their intonation, the way their voice rises and falls throughout a sentence.
Ah, that makes sense. Because intonation can convey so much meaning and emotion.
Exactly. Now, the sources we looked at also mentioned something called phonetic transcriptions.
Phonetic transcriptions, okay.
Specifically using the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. Now, I know that might sound a little scary, but it can actually be super helpful.
In what way?
Well, the IPA provides a unique symbol for every sound in English.
I see.
So it can be really useful for figuring out those tricky sounds that aren't always spelled the way they're pronounced.
Right, because English spelling can be notoriously unpredictable.
Exactly. And once you understand those symbols, you can use them to break down words and really focus on pronouncing each sound correctly. That makes a lot of sense.
And then who doesn't love a good tongue twister?
Oh, those are fun.
The sources actually recommend practicing them because they help you work on specific sounds and improve your articulation.
Yeah, they're great for like getting your tongue and your mouth muscles used to making those English sounds.
Right. And speaking of practice, recording yourself speaking and then comparing it to a native speaker is another really helpful tip.
It's like having a side-by-side comparison.
Exactly. You can hear the differences in your pronunciation and then work on those specific areas.
Okay, that's a good one.
And finally, one more thing that's super important for sounding natural. Paying attention to stress and rhythm in English.
Okay, so how do we do that?
It's about understanding which words in a sentence should be emphasized and which words are kind of glossed over.
Right, because not all words are created equal in a sentence. Some are more important than others.
Exactly. And the way we emphasize certain words and de-emphasize others creates a particular rhythm in English speech.
So it's like the music of the language.
Yes. And once you start to internalize those patterns, your English will sound much more natural and fluent.
That's awesome. So much to think about with pronunciation.
All right, so let's move on to secret number 4, which is all about expanding your vocabulary, but doing it in a way that actually sticks.
Yeah, because just memorizing lists of words can be so tedious and honestly not very effective.
Totally. The sources we looked at really stressed the importance of learning vocabulary in context.
Okay, so what does that actually look like?
Well, one of the most important things is to immediately try to use new words that you learn, both in speaking and writing.
So don't just let them sit there in your vocabulary notebook.
Right. Put them into action right away. The more you use them, the more likely they are to become a part of your active vocabulary.
That makes sense.
Another tip is to focus on learning collocations.
Collocations?
Yeah, collocations are words that tend to go together naturally in English. Like, for example, we say make a decision, not do a decision.
Ah, I get it. So it's about learning those word pairings that native speakers just instinctively know.
Exactly. And then, of course, reading and listening to a variety of English material is key.
Right. The more you immerse yourself in the language, the more vocabulary you'll naturally pick up.
And the sources also mentioned using flashcards, but not just any flashcards. They recommend using a technique called spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition.
Okay.
Yeah. Have you heard of that?
Vaguely. Remind me how it works.
Basically, it's a system where you review flashcards at increasing intervals based on how well you know the word. So you're essentially reviewing words right before you're likely to forget them.
Ah, that's smart. So it's like strategically timing those reviews for maximum retention.
Exactly. And it's been shown to be super effective for long-term memory. So the key takeaway here is that building your vocabulary is not about cramming as many words as possible into your brain.
Got it.
It's about learning words in context, using them actively, and reviewing them in a smart way. All right, so let's talk about secret number 5, which is all about immersion.
Yes. Creating that English-speaking environment around you as much as possible.
Because you know what? The more you surround yourself with the language, the more you're going to absorb it, even passively.
Absolutely. And you can do this in so many ways. One of the simplest things is to just change the language settings on your phone and your computer to English.
Oh yeah, I've done that. It's a subtle change, but it makes a difference.
It does. You're constantly seeing those English words and phrases, and it just starts to become more natural.
And it can be kind of fun, too, rediscovering your own devices in a different language.
Totally. Then, of course, there's watching movies, TV shows, YouTube videos in English.
Always a good one.
And don't feel like you need to understand every single word. Just enjoy the content and let that language wash over you.
Yeah, and you'd be surprised how much you pick up just from context and repetition.
Absolutely. Following English-speaking people or organizations on social media is another good one.
Oh, that's a good idea. You get those little snippets of English throughout the day.
Right, and it's often in a more informal, conversational style, so you can pick up on slang and idioms that you might not find in a textbook.
I like that. And what about actually interacting with people online?
Yes. The sources suggested joining online communities like Reddit or forums where people are discussing topics that you're interested in.
Oh, that's a great way to practice reading and writing in a more natural setting.
Totally. And you might even feel brave enough to start participating in those discussions yourself.
That's a good goal to work towards. So I think the takeaway here is that immersing yourself in English doesn't have to be this big, overwhelming thing. It can be as simple as making those little changes in your daily routine.
Absolutely. Okay, so our sixth secret shifts the focus to listening.
Ah, listening. So important.
So crucial. And the sources we looked at made this really interesting point. Great speakers are almost always great listeners.
That makes sense. The more you understand, the better you can communicate.
Exactly. So how do we become better listeners? Well, one suggestion is to actively expose yourself to different English accents.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's easy to get comfortable with just one accent, but in the real world, you're going to encounter a wide variety.
Right. So getting used to different accents helps you become a more flexible and adaptable listener.
Totally. And another great way to improve your listening is to, listen to things that you actually enjoy.
Okay.
So podcasts, audiobooks, anything that piques your interest. If you're engaged with the content, you're going to learn and absorb so much more.
Because you're actually paying attention.
Right. Now, another technique that was mentioned is practicing active listening.
Active listening, what's that?
So it's not just passively listening to something, it's actually making a conscious effort to engage with what you're hearing. So you can try summarizing what you've heard in your own words or taking notes.
I see. So you're really processing the information.
Exactly. And it helps you to remember it better, too. The sources also mentioned using playback speed adjustments, especially when you're first starting out.
Okay, so like slowing things down a little bit.
Exactly. It can make it easier to catch those individual words and phrases, and then as you get more comfortable, you can gradually increase the speed.
Makes sense. And I guess that classic advice of watching videos with subtitles and then slowly weaning yourself off them is still a good one, right?
Definitely. It helps you train your ear to understand spoken English without relying on the written word. So yeah, the big takeaway here is to actively seek out opportunities to listen to English in all its different forms.
Yeah, make it a habit.
Now, our seventh secret tackles a big source of anxiety for a lot of English learners. Grammar. Grammar. The dreaded grammar.
But here's the thing. The sources we looked at pointed out that fluent speakers don't necessarily think about grammar rules when they're speaking.
Really?
It's more like they've internalized those rules through so much exposure and practice that it's become intuitive for them. So they're not like mentally diagramming sentences as they speak.
Right, and that's what we should be aiming for. So how do we get there? Well, the good news is you can actually learn grammar naturally.
Naturally?
Yeah, through consistent reading and listening. You start to absorb those correct grammatical structures just by being exposed to them over and over.
So it's like osmosis?
Exactly. And another important point, don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Oh, that's a tough one.
It is, but it's so important. The more you speak, the more mistakes you're going to make. But that's how you learn.
Yeah, mistakes are just opportunities to improve.
Exactly. And speaking of improving, learning some common sentence patterns can be really helpful.
Okay, like what?
For example, if I were you, I would.
Ah, right.
These patterns can help you structure your sentences more correctly and fluently.
So it's like having a template to work with.
Exactly. And then finally, practicing writing regularly, like keeping a journal, can also help improve your grammar.
Because you have more time to think about sentence structure when you're writing?
Right. It's like a slower, more deliberate form of practice.
I like that. So when it comes to grammar, it sounds like the key is to focus on communication rather than perfection.
Absolutely. Embrace those mistakes, keep practicing, and you'll get there.
Okay, so secret number 8 deals with something that's super common among English learners. Confidence. Or rather, a lack thereof.
Yeah, the fear of making mistakes can be so paralyzing.
Totally. And it can really hold people back from speaking freely.
So how do we overcome this fear? Well, one suggestion is to adopt what's called a growth mindset.
The growth mindset. Okay.
It basically means viewing mistakes not as failures, but as opportunities to learn and grow.
So it's about shifting your perspective on making mistakes.
Exactly. Instead of getting discouraged, you see each mistake as a chance to get better.
That's a much more positive way to look at it.
It is. And along those same lines, try not to overthink things too much when you're speaking. Don't get so caught up in trying to be perfect that you can't even get a sentence out.
Right. Just go for it.
Exactly. Fluency comes from practice, not from trying to be perfect all the time.
I think that's something I definitely need to work on.
Me too. Now, another thing that can really help build confidence is actively participating in conversations.
Okay, but what if you don't have anyone to practice with regularly?
Well, there are lots of ways to find conversation partners, like language exchange programs or online communities.
Right, and in those environments, everyone's kind of in the same boat, so it's less intimidating.
Exactly. And finally, don't underestimate the power of positive self-talk.
Oh yeah, those little pep talks can make a big difference.
They really can. Remind yourself of how far you've come and celebrate those small wins along the way.
Because learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint.
It is. So be patient with yourself, keep practicing, and your confidence will grow. All right, moving on to secret number 9, which is all about those tricky little things called phrasal verbs and idioms.
Ugh, those could be tough.
They can be, but they're so important for sounding natural and understanding how native speakers really use English. Right, and they're everywhere.
They are. So how do we tackle them? Well, one suggestion is to pay close attention to how native speakers use them in conversations.
Okay, so listen for them in real-life situations.
Exactly, and try to figure out their meaning from the context.
Because they often don't translate literally.
Nope. And once you think you've got a handle on a new phrasal verb or idiom, try using it yourself.
That's a good way to make sure you really understand it.
It is. And of course, you're going to encounter them when you're reading too. So when you see one that you don't know, make a note of it, look it up, and try to understand how it's being used in that particular sentence.
So it's all about observation and practice.
Pretty much. And the more you expose yourself to them, the less intimidating they'll become.
I hope so.
Okay, ready for our 10th and final secret.
Hit me with it.
This one might seem obvious, but it's honestly so crucial. Enjoy the learning process.
Oh yeah, if you're not having fun, it's going to be really hard to stay motivated. Absolutely. So how do we make it more enjoyable? Well, one suggestion is to learn through things that you're already passionate about.
Okay.
So if you love music, listen to English songs. If you're a movie buff, watch English movies.
So make it relevant to your interests.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to get creative. The sources mentioned using games, playing roles, even acting out scenarios in English.
Those are fun ideas.
They are. And another good tip is to set achievable goals for yourself.
Okay.
So instead of saying, I want to be fluent in English, break it down into smaller, more manageable steps.
So something like, I'm going to have a 5-minute conversation in English this week, or I'm going to read one chapter of an English book.
Exactly. And then when you reach those goals, celebrate those wins.
Give yourself a pat on the back.
It makes the whole process so much more rewarding and motivating.
So ultimately, it's about finding what works for you and what keeps you engaged.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, what have we learned from all these secrets? Well, becoming fluent in English isn't about some magical formula or being born with a special talent.
Yeah.
It's about consistent effort, the right mindset, and a willingness to embrace the journey, mistakes and all.
And finding ways to make it fun.
Exactly. So here's a challenge for everyone listening. Pick just 1 or 2 of these secrets that resonated with you and make a conscious effort to use them this week. Pay attention to how they impact your learning. You might be surprised at the difference they make.
I'm going to try that too.
Awesome. Because at the end of the day, fluency isn't about knowing everything perfectly.
It's about using what you know confidently and effectively.
Exactly. So keep learning, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep enjoying the process.
Couldn't have said it better myself.